Yes, please carry on. Congratulations on starting up, and welcome to everybody. And please, Stefan, take over. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. Talking to you from good old Germany today. So far away, but not too far when we're talking digital. And the topic that I've been invited to talk about today is integrating Kepner-Tregoe within incident problem and change management. Now, let me just get this straightened. I hope you can now all see the full screen view. If somebody could just confirm that for me, or
it's starting to come up.
Okay.
We can see it. Perfect.
Okay, cool. All right. So let me just quickly introduce myself to you, and then we get going. So my name is Stefan Brahmer. I worked for Kepner-Tregoe actually for more than a decade. So to be concrete, it was 12 years in the capacity of a senior implementation lead and account manager. So hopefully I know what I'm talking about. But just recently I became partner of a small company that specializes in actually getting Kepner-Tregoe more worked into organizations and have a more fail-safe environment. So allow me to just quickly give you the context, and then we go right into the topic. So actually the topic is very, very relevant for me on a day-to-day business, because as a Kepner-Tregoe technology partner, I'm facing challenges about some of their clients, or actually our clients, coming to the point where they say, well, we love what you guys are doing, but how do we actually get it really incorporated into our day-to-day business so we see all the results? And that's one of the things that we've been also working hard on for the last couple of years, making sure that we can actually help our clients to get the most out of their integrations and out of their implementations. But I don't want to spend too much time on actually telling you what Kepner-Tregoe is. I guess those of you that have joined because it's Kepner-Tregoe will already know. And those that don't know, it would be a little bit inappropriate to spend half this presentation telling you about Kepner-Tregoe. So let me put it into some simple kind of terms quickly. So what we're talking about is we're having a questioning technique methodology that is probably certainly amongst the best, if not the best, around if you want to get to some structured collaboration and efficiency and effectiveness. But it's actually, it's about four simple things, right? It's about understanding how to clarify situations that are presented to us, either in an incident or actually in a problem capacity or actually in a change environment. So it's let us understand what needs doing and how we can actually approach this. And that's in KT language, that's called situation clarification or situation appraisal. The second thought process that is widely known and is mostly referred to also in the ITIL books, that's the problem analysis, where we're talking about analyzing the course, doing analytical troubleshooting, and getting a structured approach to come up with a conclusion about why something actually failed in the first place. The third and the fourth are very important for problem and for change, but not so popular nowadays in the IT space, and that's decision making and risk mitigation. But they're two also very strong methods. So that's basically, without doing them a disservice, that's actually what Kepner-Tregoe is all about. It's getting a structured, predictable, and reliable way of getting to something. So if that's true, then we could probably replace Kepner-Tregoe also with other methodologies. But what I want to get to is, if these are the simple things, why is it so difficult for organizations to integrate it into their processes, namely incident, problem, and change, and get all the results? Because it should be quite easy, right? It should be like, go forward, put it in, get everybody trained up, and here you go. But that's not how it works. Troubleshoot, or we want to increase, for example, the quality of our documentation. Whatever it is, what you will actually have to look at in the future is certainly when it comes to something like cloud troubleshooting, and that's something I name cloud troubleshooting just because I see more and more companies facing those challenges of not troubleshooting their legacy systems anymore, but now it's a system of people working together, namely called cloud. And it's definitely not getting simpler, it's getting more complicated. So these are the two slides that I wanted to use to put it into context. Now let's go into what I would want to talk to about why is it so difficult to integrate Kepner-Tregoe, but what is also the price if you manage to do it. A lot of implementation efforts actually fail not because the methodology or the people are not well prepared. It's because we're putting something into an organization that, compared to any kind of production environment in the classical production industry, so if you're producing cars, for example, then of course you have your processes, and because you have your production lines, and all of that is really, really nicely and works fine. Now IT, even though we call it sometimes production, is far away from anything goes in the same direction and everything goes as designed. So we have a certain level of complexity that we're dealing with, and that's what hits us hard on most of our implementation efforts. In order to explain that to you, I'm going to use what we call mechanistic thinking analogies. So the idea here is, going back to the production environments, when we look at where idle came from, many of the ideas and best practices at the time when people actually thought about it and brought it to life were actually taken from a production environment, and rightly so, and there came a lot of good learnings from it. But there's also a couple of limitations if we're finding ourselves to think mechanistically. So what does that mean? So if we assume that organizations, like machines, can be actually tuned, can be put into place and everything, then we're looking at them in a mechanistic thinking. We're also assuming that there's a solution to all problems, or that it's possible to predict and plan the future. So all these thoughts, linking effect to cause, getting the system being designed reality, those are all assumptions and those are all steps we're taking, but they're unfortunately all mechanistic thinking steps. That means we're kind of predicting that a certain action will have a certain effect, and that works well if you are in a controlled environment. Unfortunately, not always we have that. So if we're re-engineering our work processes, then sometimes we're getting along with the thought, well, if I just do that nice enough, then people will fall in line, and the so-called human behavior will also fall in line, and I'll have the same behaviors that I was actually looking for. So putting the processes in place and re-engineer them is one thing. Assuming that your people will actually start acting within those processes in an automatic kind of way is a different kettle of fish. So we don't see those kind of falling in line behaviors by default unless we really actually pay attention to what motivates people, what drives them to do that. And in our context, that would mean I can put in the best troubleshooting methodology on the planet into any given organization without taking into account that this requires behavior changes and supporting them with the appropriate actions. You won't see the results that you were probably looking for. So how can we approach this? How can we make this work for us? Well, certainly not by getting the usual suspects of, okay, let's review our vision. Of course we want top management commitment. These are all givens, but what I don't want you to think is like by just putting more people into the game and just getting more of these communication strategies out there, that will still not change all the things that you're actually facing, because it's still mechanistic thinking. So we need to get out of that mechanistic thinking box and we need to think about something different. And what helps us to actually understand this a little bit better is if we're accepting that there's no one-size-fits-all thinking, and that we can actually approach any given organization from a different angle. and that different angle is what will be explained to us by making use of the Cynefin framework. I don't know who of you has heard about the Cynefin framework, but it's actually developed, I think in 1999, by David Snowden. And David has made a lot of impact to a lot of people in the industry by just explaining to us that sometimes it is good to see that things are not always the same and that we need to apply them or need to approach them from different angles. So those of you that know about the framework will probably see it into perspective. Those of you that don't know the framework, let me just briefly explain it to you in our context. So what the Cynefin framework tells us about is that there's different levels of complexity that we can talk about. So if we're looking at the Cynefin framework in its simplicity, there's 5 different areas that we can look at, 5 domains. On the lower right, we have the so-called simple domain. We have the complicated domain, the complex domain, the chaotic domain, and the domain of disorder, status of disorder. So in our context about trying to implement a methodology into any given organization, the understanding of where we are with our respective work tasks at any given time is crucial for us to apply the right amount of methodology, for example, so we don't get pushback and we get the best possible outputs. So let's look at what we're probably all familiar with, the simple domain. And the simple domain is characterized by a cause-effect relationship that exists and is predictable and it's repeatable. So we would probably call that the known errors. We would call that the clearly defined support cases where we just look at what we're presented and we know exactly what needs doing. So in this domain, we can actually sense what's going on, we can categorize it into an existing category, and then we can respond to it in a very distinct way. So this is what most people would refer to as the best practice domain. So best practice, highly repeatable, categorized. Once we understand it, we can take action. And if you would like to see a different way of presenting it, here's a simple flow that illustrates what I'm talking about. So you have your trigger event, you receive, you check whether you have a standardized model available for this to actually deal with it, which would be, for example, a known error. Then you execute your model workflow on it, you check that it actually resolves the issue, and you close the case. Very straightforward. If any of those models are not available, then you would escalate it and check that you can actually create a model, and you would make sure that everything works out. So this is the 80–85% that an incident person would actually refer to as the known errors, as the stuff that can be solved at a service desk or any given high-rolling entity. So simple domain, relatively easy to get. Complicated actually is a slightly different approach, where we do have our cause-effect relationship, but it's not self-evident, and therefore we require a certain level of expertise. And in most of the cases, there's not just one way of doing it, but there's multiple ways of actually applying certain tools to actually get people to what they want to have. So in our triage, we now sense, analyze, and respond. And we're talking about good practice as opposed to best practice in the simple domain. Now, as you can probably see, there's a difference between good practice and best practice, because best practice, if everything we would do could be actually eliminated by best practice, then implementing any kind of methodology would be a walk in the park. You would just make people see when they apply it, they would apply it by the letter, and everything would be nice. Now, the complicated stuff is the experts working in here, and it's called also the domain of the experts. Tools like Kepner-Tregoe are very helpful here, but they're probably not the only tools in this area. So the key to integrating Kepner-Tregoe into something that also speaks about complicated domain is to make sure that we're not getting religious here, that we're not coming across like this is the only thing that can be done. And we're looking into certain incidents, we're looking into problem, we're looking into change, making sure that people understand that use what is helpful to you in order to analyze the issue at hand, and then make sure that you understand it good enough that you can actually respond to it and that you can actually solve it. And probably, if we know enough about the issue and we've analyzed it to a great extent, we can probably even make it become simple in the future by actually identifying what triggers them, what happens. So again, another illustration around complicated issues. Trigger event on the left, and then there's multiple ways and multiple states in which the incident or the issue at hand can actually work through the different stages until it actually gets resolved. There is not the one way, because if it would be the one way, then we would be in the simple domain, and we would actually have a very clear model that we can apply every single time. So let me translate that. That means if you're trying to impose a single tool to an audience of experts that are used to actually deal with more complicated issues, what you're going to see is immediate pushback. And we've seen these types of pushbacks when we actually try to actually superimpose a certain behavior pattern on experts in any of our client organizations and didn't leave them the room to choose for themselves. So the domain of experts is this space, but it doesn't mean there can only be one tool, even though there can be a preferred tool. So how do we actually work with that? Now, we don't want a carte blanche for everybody who works in this domain, so there needs to be a certain structure, but we need to be very careful that we're not kind of pinning people down to this one behavior and only one behavior that we want them to do because we've just invested in it, and we're taking out of account that there is something called a complicated setup, which prevents us from going into just one direction. Now, adding the third area here, and that's what we call the complex domain. As you can already see, I was one step ahead here. There is certain relationship between cause and effect, but it's actually not that we can just sense it and go for it. We need to do some probing, and that's why this three-step approach here is probe, sense, and respond. So it takes a good deal of probing, experiment, making sure that we actually understand how a complex scenario works. That would be in our technical world, that would be test scenarios, that would be pre-production system that we actually execute some experiments on in order to get a better feeling about what might be causing it. So this is where people will use all kinds of different approaches, and it's called emergent practice. So emergent practice means we're working our way through developing that best way of actually going in order to move it, hopefully, from complex to complicated. And again, a methodology like Kepner-Tregoe in this context can only be fully helpful if it's combined also with other tools and other approaches to make sure that we're actually getting there. So you see already, from moving from the simple to the complicated to the complex domain, of course Kepner-Tregoe can have a lot of positive impact on the simple domain, but it's more the bit that is about understanding the situation you're in and the initial phases. If somebody actually thinks about you would always have to fill out a bespoken form from the top left to the lower right in order to make progress in this domain, then you're going to see a lot of pushback. The complicated domain is probably the main area where you get the most natural kind of uptake if you allow yourself and your people to actually choose between certain tools and make use of whatever is useful for them in any given scenario, and you just not pin them down and tell them that this is the only tool you need to use. And then in complex you have the emergent practice where it's more about understanding what's going on. So you won't see that cause-effect chain in a sequential order that you can just work off. It takes a lot of experts to work around a certain issue and then hopefully do a structured analysis to come up with the response. Here's this gentleman. I think we all know Albert Einstein. And Albert, one of his famous sayings is, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Now, he was probably looking at it from a different angle, but if we're looking at it from our world, then I have to say, well, unfortunately I disagree, Mr. Einstein, because we can do the same things over and over again, and because of our highly volatile, our highly complex environments and the changing nature of where we're actually executing our different services, you can see different results, and we need to understand that, and we need to be ready for it. So number 4 is the chaotic domain. So here we're actually seeing a certain level. Now you can be by intention in this space, and that would be if you wanted to be in the innovation mode, or you can be in this space actually unintended, and that's when you actually want to get out of this space as soon as possible. So that would be any kind of disaster, anything that actually was not anticipated, and it requires you to get out of this state of chaos into some orderly fashion. So the one thing that we need to accept in the chaotic space is that there is no direct perceivable relationship between cause and effect. We won't find any patterns as we've seen them before, and that means we're certainly at random. And the approach we're going to take is really to stop the bleeding and make sure that we stabilize the situation at hand. So if you find yourself a lot into these areas, then the first step is really not trying to solve it, but to stabilize the situation and get a better understanding, so you can actually move it into one of the other areas and deal with it in a structured way. That would, for example, count for many of our major incident or critical situations around incident management, but it could also be something where an emergency change actually went unfortunately wrong, and now we're facing a situation that's even worse than what we had before, and you need to make sure that your people are now getting into this. Now, something like that is just another application scenario in which you can actually integrate KT into your scenarios, but it makes the need even more important that you actually look at what is the situation at hand, how do we get some clarity about what we're facing, so you're actually looking at a front end of a certain approach, and you try to move out of the chaotic into the complex or complicated space. It's unlikely that you're going into the simple space. However, there are cases where you actually move from the simple space into the chaotics right away by just not paying enough attention to what would be called a standard change or a standard fix, and then it all goes wrong because it wasn't so standard this time, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a chaotic breakdown situation, and then you need to move your way up back again into the complex or the complicated space. So here, chaotic is all about activity. Make sure that you act in order to stabilize the situation and get it into a more actionable point, so that you can actually move it from the turbulent and highly uncertain space to something that can be actually worked on in a structured way. So that would be the complex, the complicated space, where you can actually work on it most effectively. Now this leads us, that means you're actually thinking about novel practice, something nobody has done before, and you would actually have to work your way out by just playing it minute by minute, making sure that you actually make progress. So a high need for people to actually put some structure to that chaotic thing, which is the whole discussion around major incident leads, major incident managers, escalation managers, whatever you call them in your organization. And as I said, that leaves us with the space of disorder. Now, Mr. Snowden himself actually tells us that in most cases we're actually starting off in the domain of disorder, and then we're trying to actually identify it quite quickly in which domain we need to put any of our given scenarios. And that's actually the connecting point why I've chosen this framework for our topic, Because I think in any given case, before you can apply a methodology, before you can actually work on something, you need to understand what you're facing, and then you apply as much or as many methodologies in order to actually get yourself out of that space of disorder and tackle the issue at hand in any of the 4 remaining domains. And that's kind of dependent on what your understanding is. So replace Kepner-Tregoe with any other methodology in order to apply it most appropriately. You want to make sure that you understand what you're facing. And that's this move into the simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic from the point of disorder. And I've seen it a lot in the different companies that I worked with. Many times, once people get going on something, it works actually quite nicely, but the majority of time that is lost without need to be lost is actually lost at the beginning of each interaction, and it could be an incident, it could be the problem, it could be a change. If we don't understand what it's all about, then we're likely to actually put resources on something that then turns out to be not the right approach or needs to be recalibrated. So at that point in time, getting out of disorder into something that you can action on is quite important, and that's one of the challenges that we see with our clients. They invest into a methodology, they invest into their people, and that's great. At the same point in time, we should also invest into our understanding about, okay, how do we actually apply the tools that we've just been given? And there's a lot of uncertainty also on, for example, how management and senior management reacts once something has been trained. I mean, for some people it's the Holy Grail approach. So now you've been trained, so clearly you can solve everything. For some people it feels just different, because now you have your people sitting there telling you that they need to think before they can act. Now that, in an industry that has been pushing people to activities for quite some time, is a bit of a shaker. And thinking is a good thing, but it also needs to be visible, it also needs to be in an orderly fashion. But it's actually intended to get us out of that state of disorder into some clearly, how do we approach this? So let me put that into a couple of more precise statements about what this means for your organization if you choose to actually do something about this. So if you feel like you want to get results, and that's kind of assuming that you've already chosen a certain methodology that you want to put in place, then nothing replaces your understanding about what are the challenges that people are facing. I mean, it's clearly not only we want to become a better organization, but what precisely are the challenges that you're seeing that you want to be fixed by actually bringing in any kind of methodology. And it's one of these questions that sometimes people just, when we engage with them and we say, so what do you want to be fixed? They come with the usual suspects about, we want to fix stuff quicker, we want to have higher first-time fix rate, customer satisfaction should be going up, and yeah, we want to be a better place. And these are all good, but it's like, what are the challenges that we're seeing actually when people actively troubleshoot, or when they actively perform the problem management function, or when they actually perform the change management function? A lot of times it's more the processes that we're being shown and not necessarily what happens on the floor. So we need to look into that, and I'll get into more details on the next slide. Then you should always put your practices within the appropriate tool landscape. Now, I know we all have invested heavily in tools, but when I'm talking tools here, I'm talking about everything that potentially supports or hinders our techies, our engineers, in actually performing a specific task. And you can train people in a great methodology if none of your tools is actually supporting the documentation of what people are doing. Then you've created yourself a nice barrier for success, just because people will actually come forward and say, this is all good, but I have no place to do it. Now, not that any of our engineers have joined the company because they love documentation, but we should also make it as easy as possible for them to do some documentation And if you're in the journey around knowledge management or namely KCS or any of the other approaches, then documentation is kind of a must. Otherwise, you just run dry on your pipeline. The third bullet is all about getting to critical mass. So what we're also seeing is that you either do it and you get to about 60 to 85% penetration rate in any given target audience, or you should actually consider not doing it at all. Because what we've learned is that there's a lot of let me go back into what I've done before kind of behavior and certain pushback unless you have a certain number of people within any given target audience that are going through the same kind of behaviors. And last but not least, you should think in value streams. There is no such thing like a single function that you can actually apply a methodology to and get the maximum output, but I'll also talk to that. So I'm going to break these four down and talk to them individually. So what challenges are your people facing? Well, it's one thing to look at a documented process, and it's a different thing to actually see what people do in order to get their daily work done. So when we actually approach client sites, we always ask for, well, tell me or show me how people work. And then in the majority of cases, people will actually get some digital or physical documentation and put them in front of us and say, this is how we work. And normally we're going to look at them and say, really? You're sure? You bet money on that you're working like this? And then we ask them to walk us to where people are really working and check whether they are actually working in the way. And sure enough, most of the time, for the good, people will have found ways around certain steps that are either impractical or not really making sense. And their daily work looks slightly different from what the documented process is, even though they're still following the process steps about classification and clarification and investigation and all these steps. Yes, they're there, but how is work really done and how many people interact with each other? That's what you want to understand, because only then you can actually help them improve their situation. And the one thing that always kind of gets interesting is we cannot have only the troops perform a certain methodology and leave management aside. I call it the management humming. When you're actually facing more important issues and you get certain uncertainty, you'll find more and more managers, internal and external, coming in and asking questions. And it goes to the point that some of the engineers keep complaining that if it runs long enough, then they spend more time explaining themselves to the management compared to what they're actually working on the real cases. And that's not meant to be as a criticism to management, because it's a natural function and a natural behavior that if there is a higher perceived risk, then obviously you'll do whatever it takes to make sure that that risk is mitigated. And in our context, it means you're going to ask questions about when can we expect a solution, or what's going on, or how do we actually making progress. So if we want to implement a methodology, please consider at least adding your management layers. And the most important one is the middle management layer here. To pay attention to this and to understand what we're trying to achieve. Otherwise, you're going to run into conflicts of interest, or you have KPI issues where implementing this methodology actually contradicts one of the volume targets that one of the middle managers might have. So it's important that we include them and that we actually start at the very front end, and that's situation clarification. And there is no excuse. If you're implementing Kepner-Tregoe or you're integrating it into your processes, the thing that is an absolute must is the blue card, as we would say, or the situation appraisal card. So that by itself will yield great results, and that's why we're also, as a technology partner of Kepner-Tregoe, for example, have put a lot of emphasis in getting digital scenarios that drill this capability of situation clarification. because we've seen it work, and we know that if you implement your situation appraisal in an appropriate way, not only your people become more effective, but you're also stepping away from those inappropriate routings or putting resources on stuff that then later on turns out as non-value add. So if you want to take one thing away from this, an integration of Kepner-Tregoe always requires you to put a lot of emphasis on the blue card, not the red card. And those of you that probably got trained in Kepner-Tregoe before will know that the people that come from the basic training, they always want to apply the red card, which is the problem analysis, the analytical card for troubleshooting, and the blue card gets certainly not the amount of attention that it should, because at the end of the day it all starts with understanding what's going on. So talking about tools, when you support your practices with the appropriate tools, what I mean by that is like there is no one tool to drive behavior change. You need to consider certain areas. It's about how people do things, how you support them in their doing, what is the documentation, and how do you steer the process. So there can be many tools that actually work hand in hand, because the logic, if it's the right tools, is going to be along the same lines. So you can actually easily apply certain tools within any given implementation. And that's why an integration project typically also has roles like lead integrator and has key users and people that are actually facilitating the change around the behaviors. The most interesting thing is probably the ticketing systems. So if you're looking at your itSM systems and you look at the usual suspects, a remedy implementation, or you look into ServiceNow, or you look into Service Center, any of those, none of those are generically built to actually support the doing of incident and problem management. Change management is slightly different, but at least the first ones, it's not about how you actually investigate. It's about administering and capturing all the activities around an incident that the systems are built for. So you need to think about, if you want to apply a methodology, then that's not going to be driven by your tool, but the tool should be capable to capture some of the information that you're actually getting. You can actually apply different other tools and techniques to drive behaviors, and the mix is important. And that it would be foolish to give you a kind of like, this is what you should apply, because it depends on the maturity level of your organization. It depends on what you already have in use. If you use on-the-job coaching already, why would you reinvent the wheel and do another one? Make use of what you have and what has worked for you in the past. And if you don't have anything, just be aware of the fact that people will not take something on by themselves without the supporting environment that makes them see that they're doing a good job, and a couple of reiterations where they positively have applied something. And please make sure that your tools are not contradicting each other. We've seen organizations, the bigger they are, the more tools they have in use. So that could be multiple instances of an itSM tool. It could be multiple instances of certain tools doing the same thing, but in different areas of the company for different people. And the more you want to be consistent in applying something, make sure that you don't have contradicting tools. And I know this is a battle, because everybody will love their tool for one reason or the other, but you need to actually get it addressed. Otherwise, it's going to actually hit you and bite you in the back when you actually try to put something in place. Now let's go back to this 60 to 85% of each target audience. If you're serious about implementing something, then critical mass is all that matters. If you only get 2 out of 10 people trained into any given target audience, and then you expect them to actually hold up the new behaviors, what you're going to see is some friendly pushback and friendly pressure applied from the remaining 8, which is represented in my second bullet here, that the few willing adopters will be invited to stop their new behavior by their colleagues. And this is not meant to be like in a bad way. It's not that people are by default bad and they don't want, but that we're not built to embrace change necessarily when it comes to our behaviors. So the human being is a creature of habit, and that means if we've worked in a certain way and it has not given us major setbacks, then we'll make this way the least effortful way of working. And any change that you try to actually impose or bring into any given organization is going to be perceived as a disturbance to this. This is how we always work. So it's going to be extra effort. It's going to be extra attention that's needed to actually make that change happen. And if you don't have enough people executing that change, then it will just die, because the majority will not allow these people to perform. And we've seen it. And the most reasonable or the most recent example is an organization where we started off, and because everybody got so excited, we allowed the organization to bring in people from different areas of the organization at the same time, which then turned out such a diluting factor that we didn't get critical mass in the areas that were initially the target audience, and it has bitten us in the back greatly. So, and that was probably our fault from being the external consultants to allowing that. Make sure you pick your target audiences and then get them to critical mass, and only then you can allow other people to join. And if you look at it from the client side, well, clearly, again, my 2 out of 10 example, if you call somebody 10 times and 2 times you get somebody working differently compared to the other 8 times, then you won't perceive that as the organization as such has actually changed their behavior. It's going to be diluted, it's going to be watered down, and you're going to see people being frustrated because they don't get the feedback that they should get, because people don't recognize them for what they're doing. And you probably had that experience in the past also. Now the 4 months on this page is just an indicator. If we're talking South Africa and you're starting your project in December, well, then make that 5 or 6 months, please. But that's basically a period of time in which we want to make sure that there's no major holidays or something. We can concentrate on getting stuff doing. If it takes more than 4 months, you're going to see that the first people are dropping off already before the last ones actually come on the wagon. And last but not least, the value stream thinking. A lot of people that we talk to think in functions. So they're going to come and say, help us make our problem managers better. Help us to work with our escalation managers, or work with whoever we have here that is an expedited kind of function. Well, yes, of course you can train those, but if you're looking into a bigger picture and you're trying to make a real impact, then it's not enough to have the receiving end of any given function being trained up and being capable in doing something, but you want all the contributors also to work along at least the same lines, so you can get maximum benefits by having your incident managers following a specific approach, or your problem managers, or having your change manager actually asking for certain input types, and you don't get the usual question about what are the risks associated to this change, and the only thing you see is none. I mean, I hope we all agree that this is not the intent of that question, and making it easier for people to understand how they can actually fill that kind of question with some relevant data, as opposed to just, yeah, because I haven't thought about it, I'll put in none because it has no consequences whatsoever. That's a different way of looking at it. And we don't want people to be frustrated because they understand what other people could do, but they're not seeing that behavior, and therefore they either do it themselves, which is undesired, or they actually end up being frustrated because they thought other people could have done it in a better way. So think about, what do you want to achieve, who's actually working within that value stream, so who's a contributor to your output, and try to get as many contributors as possible being involved and being included into this, because it also has a secondary advantage, and that is when you start managing the white space. By white space, we mean you have any given process flow, and you have the actors within your process, and then you're also seeing that you have spaces in between where one entity talks to the other. And that is what we call the white space. And any given kind of approach like Kepner-Tregoe will help you manage that space. And that's the end, just summing up. So make sure you deal, when you deal with different levels of complexity, make sure that you're able to adapt your tools and have them up to the requirements. So that's the whole Snowden approach. Tools should actually help people do their daily life. They should not dictate what they do in their daily life. I know this is a philosophical approach, but it's important that tools are not just satisfying our process documentation needs, but that they actually help. There is no such thing like one tool, and I can only say that 10,000 times because sometimes people really have the tool decision make the choice for them, and it's not that way. Get to critical mass, and when you have many different contributors to any given scenario, make sure that they talk to each other and that they ideally use the same approach. And as my final sentence, performance improvements of 20+% might be a good enough motivator to think about this. So with that said, I know I overran a little bit. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think we have some time for questions.
Stefan, thank you very much for your insight. We do have some questions, so I'm going to go with the first one. How can people improve the sense part of each area?
Can you say, how can people improve what?
The sense part. So if you look at the 4 domains that you were talking about, yes. Simple, complex, etc.
Yeah.
If you look at the sense position, how do you improve that?
Let me just go back here. So which position are we talking about? I'm just having the think spot.
How do you improve the sense? So how do you sense things better?
Ah, the sense. Oh, sorry, that's my inappropriate understanding of the English language. Well, sense is all about understanding the situation that you're in, right? So if we translate that into what do we do to sense, it's what do we do to actually grasp what's happening, what is the situation. So if you use Kepner-Tregoe, that will be the blue segment is about asking the right questions. And an example would be, in the simple domain, you can't be satisfied with somebody telling you, I have problems with this and this application. You need to get to the point that people are understanding that in order to have the sense correctly, they need to be able to describe what do you see, feel, hear, smell, anything that can be actually recognized as an observable or a describable kind of deviation. That's what we want to have. We want them to be more attentive to the detail, and in a lot of client situations, people are just happy that they got something from the customer, right? And they're not making enough effort to make sure that they get a description along the lines like, we're seeing this and this fault with this and this function on this and this application. So it's about the level of detail in which we can actually put our perception so that we can then put it into the right category, or we can use this input for analyzing or any of those. So it's a couple of questions that you can ask.
Thank you.
Hello? I hear myself. Do you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me now. Okay. Well, I was just hearing myself, but no one else. So that's really what it is about, the questions about what you can observe and what other people can observe, and put it into the right context.
Okay. Our next question is, how do you recognize value streams?
Well, for me, and this might be just my way of looking at it, is if we're in a incident management environment, then at the end of the day, is all about getting it up and running again. I know there's a lot more about adding value to our customers, but if we're just talking about our environment that we have in our control, and we're just saying, okay, what needs to be done in order to get this up and running again? So we diagnose the initial issue that might include the customer or our users. Then who is actually involved in troubleshooting? If it's a more complicated thing, then in many cases you'll have multiple departments being involved. So it might be networking, it might be applications, might be databases, and so on and so on. And in order to actually get it solved, all these people will have a contribution to your incident. And the same thing about problem. If you're actually investigating in a root cause analysis and you apply your 5 or whatever kind of approach you're following there, then you're also going to have certain contributors. And if you don't include all of them within your investigation, you're going to lose out. Now, this could also be led by understanding what your service chain looks like. So I'm just talking about value and making sure that you're not isolating it to one person, but you always try to actually look at the overall flow of things.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question I've got here is, how does documentation mesh with knowledge management?
Well, let me say this. I think we all appreciate if knowledge is being built, but the story is really about, well, first of all, in order to build knowledge, you need to know where to put knowledge. People need to use it. Documentation is kind of key, because if you try to actually document stuff that should go into your knowledge base only at the time when you actually put a knowledge base candidate in, then you literally have double the work, or you have to go back to somebody and say, please come up with what was the documented kind of evidence in this case, but you're probably like 3-4 weeks down the line. So the nature of the human being is that we cannot remember the nitty-gritty details of each of the steps we've been performing during an outage or whilst we were actually in the trenches. We will only remember what has a high level of emotional tagging, and that means if we document post-mortemly, it will always be incomplete. The only way for us to get an appropriate input into knowledge management that goes beyond what people can remember is if we're documenting on the go. And that's something that is highly supported by approaches like Kepner-Tregoe, where we ask people to document whilst they're actually analyzing, and that kind of then consistent input into knowledge management. I've seen quite a bit of organizations embarking on the journey around knowledge management, and some of them are further down, some of them have just started. But getting knowledge into the knowledge base is one thing, getting people to use it is a different thing, and getting it actually staying current and up to date is the third challenge. So as I said earlier, I have not seen any larger group of individuals within technical support that love documentation, but I've seen a lot of people that actually could have done a better job.
Thank you. Anyone else that wants to have a question? Okay, Stefan, it doesn't seem that we have any more questions. Thank you so much for your time. It's highly appreciated. It was very insightful.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Stefan.
Thank you. That was brilliant.
Okay, we're gonna. It was fantastic. So I'm gonna just move to Johann's presentation, if you will just allow me a moment. Can you see the presentation, Johann's presentation?
Well, Marina is trying to do that. The only way that I could connect is via the phone. So I have to steer her through the slides that I don't see. So if you, it's going to be a bit annoying because I'm going to say next slide, next slide, next slide. So just be with me.
Peter?
Yes, great. Thanks a lot for being with us, Johann. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Carry on.
Can you see the screen with Johann's presentation on it?
So we're on the first one that says, why change fail? Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm not going to be as politically correct as Stefan was, so I will call a spade a shuffle. I always love these talks because then I don't speak to a specific customer and I can actually say what I want to say. I will try and offend everybody equally. The chat today is really something that I, as a practitioner or as a consultant and coach, finds really disturbing. We spend a tremendous amount of time and effort trying to help organizations to do things better, but do you know what? Most of the time, it actually doesn't work. So if we look at this next slide, there's some figures from the study. What they do is they, on a yearly basis, evaluate the success rates of projects in the IT space. They have got subcategories. They talk about successful, challenged, and failed. But quite honestly, if it's not successful, then it has actually failed. So then, if you don't realize all the benefits that you've promised, but some, then it can't be all bad. Also, is that in every single project that we do, whether it's a technology project, whether it's an organizational change project, we always start with a business case. And this business case is we're going to spend so much time, effort, money, and it's going to realize this benefit. And if we only realize half of the benefit, well, then we're sitting with a business case that's not true anymore. So if we go to the next slide, it's not only about projects. The brutal fact is that most change initiatives, and that's the stuff that we do from a best practice, good practice perspective, so all the IT service management stuff, so the ITILs, the COBITs, the TOGAS, all of that stuff, most of these projects actually is not making the mark. What's very interesting is that there's multiple sources that backs the story up, including somebody like McKinsey, who also claims that most of the stuff that they do are successful. But in spite of that, I say, despite the 25,000 books about change management, organizational change management, in their words, 66% of programs. So that means 30% of these projects, the programs that we're busy with, is successful. So only 30% of the time when we try and implement best practice or have good governance or improve processes or any of this stuff does it actually work. Now, quite honestly, as a parent, if you bring me a report card with 30% on it, I will not be a very happy chappy. Now, it's interesting in Stefan's presentation, he talked about the definition of insanity that Albert Einstein defined. And actually, in this sense, I agree with Einstein. The problem is that most of these initiatives that we embark on essentially uses the same tools that's been around since the 1920s, since Taylor's time. And we keep on using the same change management techniques, and we keep on doing these projects, and every time we hope that it's going to be better, and it's not. Well, the definition of insanity is. So what do I propose? Well, What I'm saying is that we need to start thinking a little bit more laterally. Forget about the popular literature, because that's only going to help you to succeed 1/3 of the time. The other thing that I'm also saying is that most change initiatives fail because there was a lack of leadership within the organization. We're actually at a point where if we start with an engagement with an organization, we go through a vetting process with the management team, and quite often we say to them that we're actually not your partner. We don't want to help you with this. And it's not because we fat-headed or whatever, but we've come to realize that it's actually a waste of time and resources unless we get the full commitment of management involved. And do you know what? In the 1980s, the silver bullet was TQM, and everybody was doing total quality management. And look at these quotes from why TQM failed. The people don't believe it because the focus is short-term. It's about making money. It's about the organization. It's not about being better. In fact, management just want to make it somebody else's problem. It's a very interesting quote for me, and I can't remember the website that I got this from, that I really like this. Successful change initiatives depend on frontline managers, not change managers. So that basically means that your facilitator of change in the organization is the manager of that area. And it's how that manager actually changed their role within the organization and how the structure within management changes that's going to make change successful in the organization. So the long and short of it, change failure is caused by a lack of leadership. A lack of setting an example, and that's why I've got this photo of Ragnar Lothbrok here, because a leader means that other people are following. And we need to start changing our behavior as managers and leaders in organizations if we want to be successful in actually getting results from change initiatives, from making the organization a place for all stakeholders. And that includes our shareholders that want bigger profit. I propose that we actually start thinking a little bit about lean and agile thinking as a solution. You must probably then, or will be some of you at least, who will tell me that you've been online and you've seen that 90% to 98% of lean implementation fails. And why would you want to choose something that really is as bad as that? And isn't there a better way of doing it? And shouldn't we rather stick with a tried and tested way? Well, there's a few things that I just quickly want to tell you about that. If you actually go and look at the numbers behind that claim on the web, that 98% is actually nonsense. And what it actually makes me think of is that, that 88.2% of statistics are made up on the spot. In that specific article, that's one of those examples. So somebody did a bit of fact checking, and you can see it if you want the link. You can actually, I'll send you the link where the facts are. You can see that it's real. The other thing that I want to leave with you is that I didn't say you need to go and implement lean and agile. I said we need to have lean and agile thinking. Because implementing lean and agile is about the methods and the tools and the techniques. But if you only focus on the methods and the tools and the techniques, you are going to fail. Because there's a driver behind it, there's thinking behind it. And that's what I want to explore. Now, it makes me think of, in the 1990s, the big thing was business process re-engineering. And every re-engineering initiative failed. as a answer to that, Michael Hammer in one of the following books actually made this comment. Just because you say you're re-engineering doesn't mean that you are re-engineering. And my experience in the last few years in terms of people and organizations who say that they've embraced things like Lean and Agile and DevOps and whatever, actually don't really know what it is. I think Dilbert puts it spot on in these two little comic strips, how people approach the implementation of things like Lean and Agile and DevOps in their environment. Now, Lean and Agile doesn't mean that there's no controls. It doesn't mean that we do what we want to do. It doesn't mean that there's not a process. It doesn't mean that it's going to be cheaper. It doesn't mean that it's going to take less resources initially. So here's some made-up statistics for you. 95% of people doing Agile don't know what Agile, or for that matter, Lean or DevOps, or any of the frameworks that are based on Lean is all about. So why do I say Lean and Agile thinking is a solution? Well, the first reason why I say so is because I know it works, but apparently that's not good enough. So what I want to do is I want to share a wonderful book with you, and if you haven't read it, I would really encourage you to actually go and get this book and read this book. In fact, this is one of the books that's on my yearly reading list now. It's called From Good to Great, and it's by a gentleman by the name of Jim Collins. Collins used a big research team, and they collected data in the US about listed companies, and they were looking for organizations with 10 to 15% far above average growth. The target that they set was 12% better than market. But the companies that they used as examples eventually did much better than that. What's really interesting in this book and in this research is that the things that you would have expected great organizations or organizations that had the ability to go from a good company to a great company, that they do is not the things that you get from a rah-rah, hoo-ha, leader, manager, motivational speaker. What they identified is actually 6 key things that these organizations were doing that made them different from the rest. And these 6 things that they did was anchored in another approach. So let me quickly go through the things that the team, that Jim Collins' team identified as indicators of organizations with sustained growth and leadership positions within the specific industry. The first one is they called it level 5 leadership. This is a leader that's not an I person. This is a leader that's an us person. It's a person that's really humble, professional, that is very strong-willed, but they were not egotistic. The second principle that they've identified is first doing what these leaders got right is they first assembled a team around them of competent people, the right people, the people that they can gel with, work with, or sometimes the challenges them the whole time. And they got rid of the wrong people. So figuring out where everybody needs to fit onto the bus. It's only once this team was in place that the team then confronted the brutal truth, the brutal facts about the organization, what it's doing, how it's doing, its place in the market. And without losing faith in the helplessness of the situation, we're able to realize how big the challenge really was. The next concept that I've identified, they call the hedgehog. and that is made up of these circles. So the hedgehog is basically saying that you must have this one principle that you protect, this one thing that you want to do that makes you different from the organization or from the industry. It's not good enough to be competent. You must be best at something. And the three things that you need to ask yourself when you identify this concept is, what are you passionate about? What are you really, really, really good about, good at? And how does your organization make money? What's the economic drivers? All of this was sitting on a platform, and it is a platform because in the previous picture you must probably saw that they were black blocks with discipline in it, a culture of discipline. And the reason why discipline is so important is because if you've got disciplined people, you don't need hierarchy. If you've got disciplined thought, you don't need bureaucracy. And if you've got disciplined action, you don't need excessive control. You don't need heavily defined processes, procedures, controls, policies, all that stuff. All of these successful organizations utilize technology as an accelerator, but never as the primary means of transforming the organization or as their primary competitive advantage. So those are the 6 things that were identified by Collins and his team. And these 6 things lives within another concept that they call flywheel versus the doom of loop, the loop of doom. Now, for those of you who've ever seen a flywheel, it's a very heavy piece of machinery within an engine, and the purpose of a flywheel is to maintain momentum. So it's really difficult to get the flywheel to turn at the beginning. In the beginning it's very slow, but then it starts picking up speed, and then it maintains momentum. Even if something then goes wrong, the momentum stored within the flywheel actually helps us to get over the hump. The interesting thing about a flywheel is it starts slowly. None of these organizations had grand schemes when they started off. They started, they identified what they needed to do, they started doing something, and then something else, and then something else, and it became bigger and faster and more. So why do I talk about good to great if I said we need to think about lean and agile? Well, the reality is that actually if you compare these 6 or 7 concepts that you identified that made organizations successful in Good to Great, actually it maps 100%, no, not really 100%, but nearly 100% to lean agile thinking. So if we talk about level 5 leadership, in lean and agile we talk about the servant leader, the leader that spends his or her time helping people to achieve. If we talk about confronting the brutal facts, in lean and agile we say we do fact-based decision making. We don't get emotional about stuff, we collect the facts, we look at them brutally, and based on what we see, we take action. The one bit that's not really the same is this concept of the hedgehog. So what is the thing that you're going to be best at versus in lean and agile we say the voice of the customer is the most important thing. I can actually see that these 2 things can get together, maybe the hedgehog concept from a strategic perspective, and once you've actually done that, a strategic shift over to listening to our customers and their experience of whatever we're offering them. A culture of discipline maps to rules that we define within lean and agile. Things like we don't pass defects downstream. 5S, define the roles and responsibility. Making everything visible. Pretty Great talks about technology as an accelerator, and in Agile we say automate routine work. Now, interesting, if you actually look at that 11 framework that Stefan just talked about, is where work is not complex. So in the simple domain, those are the best candidates for automation. And that frees us up our expensive resource within IT organizations to actually go and deal with complicated, most probably at first, but yeah, even some of those things we can start to automate or standardize and make simpler so that we can actually use our skilled people to focus on things like complex problems and deal with chaotic problems. So that is a technique that's called swarming. But it's not the tool that's important. It's the principle, it's the concept. The concept of the flywheel we find in Lean and Agile also, where we talk about things like continual improvement, solving problems, Plan, Do, Check, Act, Kaizen, the MAAC from a Six Sigma perspective. So, in essence, the proof that these things are working is not in somebody somewhere on the internet that had a chat with a few buddies and decided most of these projects don't work. There's actually the evidence is sitting as academic evidence, Jim Collinson being academic, in Good to Great. Good to Great to a large extent epitomizes Lean and Agile thinking. So, what do we mean by Lean and Agile thinking? Well, the first thing that you need to realize is that for most organizations, if we talk about this, it most probably would mean a fundamental shift of management and leadership within the organization from where we are at the moment to where we're going to be in time. And that makes it very difficult. So it starts at the top with service leadership. Then we need to think about getting people to actually work together, breaking down silos, getting rid of us and them, getting people to talk, defining what it is that we actually do, how we do it, measure whether we do it. So then we start talking about focused discipline. So contrary to popular belief, Lean and Agile is not being a cowboy. It is actually about focused discipline. Other things that need to change is we need to measure what we do differently. And we also need to look at performance and the measurement of performance and reward differently within the organization. Because we're moving away from the individual to the team. You obviously need the right tools, and when I talk about tools here, I'm not necessarily talking about software. I'm talking about you must probably hear about when you do a Lean or an Agile course. So doing a stand-up meeting is just a tool. A Kanban board is just a tool. Doing value stream mapping is just a tool. It is not Lean. It is not Agile. It's just tools that we use. The other thing that you need to bear in mind is that because it is so difficult to do this, once management has bought into this, and don't even try this once, or if the management team, or at least the CEO or the top-level management in the organization has bought into this, is they will most probably need to get a sense of. They will need somebody to help them to talk through the challenges, to give perspective, to sometimes show them how to wax on and wax off. And why it's so important that the leadership and the management within the organization actually grasp these concepts and principles and thinking and the tools and the techniques is because they will need to become a coach for the rest of the organization. So this means slow change. It doesn't mean fast change. So if you're looking for something to lift you out of immediate trouble because you're worried about the next financial reporting cycle, most probably take the heat in the next reporting cycle. Do things right and start thinking long term. People in organizations are sick and tired of hearing every 6 months they need to do something different. Now, this is flavor of the month. We're going to do ITIL. We're going to do TOGAF. We need COVID. We've got cyber security. We've got this. We've got that. And most people actually just want to do their work and ignore all this noise around them. What you need to bear in mind is that nobody can change somebody else. The only thing that we can do is we can help other people develop so that over time there is an improvement in the organization and we start doing things better. Slowly, but surely. And if you come to think of it, that PDCA, Deming was a wise man. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about different change theories. So this is 1980s, this is pre-Kotter, but essentially these are the two main streams or the two main views of facilitating change in organizations. There's the economic theory and there's the organizational theory. So theory E says, well, we're going to do the difficult stuff. We're going to lay off people. We're going to downsize. We're going to rip it apart. We're going to reconstruct. We're going to do all the stuff. And all of this stuff is really, really painful, but we want a measurement, and we want a measurement soon, and that measurement must be an economic measurement. Theory O, on the other hand, says, if we want to do things better, we have to invest in the organization, its people, its processes, and its culture, and all of these things. So over time, we know it's going to take time. We're going to learn, we're going to use the expertise and the experience of our people to make it a better place to be. If you talk about lean and agile thinking, that includes DevOps, we subscribe to the theory O view of the work, so the organizational view. So not the economic view, not coming up with a new strategy and just saying to other people they need to fit in, or but to think about what we do in the organization, how we do things in the organization, and how we can, as an organization, grow to this new destination. That means cultural change. Cultural change doesn't happen overnight. But it's really, really important because, as getITright said, culture eats breakfast every time. It's strategy for breakfast every time. Okay? So really important that we actually start thinking about these things, lean and agile thinking. So what do I mean by this? Well, lean and agile and DevOps and all this stuff is actually a philosophy first. So if you're coming from a lean perspective, it's about long-term thinking. It's about making sure that you get rid of things that's not helpful, eliminating waste, growing people, being respectful towards people, recognizing that they've got skills and competencies, and that's the reason why they're there. But also trying to learn from our mistakes and make the organization a better place, because we constantly learn and we improve. And that's not that different from agile thinking, because in fact agile thinking is based on lean. So individual interactions, working software, talking to people, responding to change. Those are the important things. So think about the things behind it. Don't think about the tools. Don't go and do this agile or the Scrum course and say, I've learned how to be a stand-up team, and I can manage a Kanban board, and I know what a product backlog is, or I know how to do value stream mapping, or the tool is not the important thing. The tool follows. So establishing the culture, or a culture, trust and common values, is the thing that management need to focus on. And then slowly but surely we can start applying these tools. And from a lean perspective, yes, there is order in which you apply these tools. So we start at the bottom, standardize work, measure stuff, organize our work environment, get rid of clutter. Only then can we start thinking about, what goes wrong, how can we make it better, how do we show that things are going wrong, how do we make sure that we don't try and do too much, and so forth, and actually start building on this maturity scale. So all through this space is not ideally suited at all parts of the journey. The more mature we become, more different tools we can start using. Something else that I want to maybe just leave with you is, now most of you most probably have got some exposure to COVID, and in COVID we talk about the goals cascade, so organizational goals cascades down to goals for the unit, cascade down to goals for a smaller unit, or even for a process or a practice or whatever. The problem with the goals cascade is as it cascades, for each one of these goals is a bunch of KPIs. But the measurement's becoming more and more and more and more. By the end of the day, when you get to the person doing the work, there's like 50 different KPIs on the table. If you want this right, you actually need to turn the cascade around. Yes, you need to define what the superordinate goals are, but you actually need to start from the individual with a few KPIs, maybe 3 or 4 things that's important to them. And then you combine those to the manager. So the 3 or 4 maybe becomes 6 or 8. And then you combine those for the manager of the division. You know? And it becomes, I don't know, 20 or whatever. So to make things simple, and I quite like this quote from the gentleman who wrote the book that was called The Little Prince. Perfection is achieved not when there's nothing to add, but when there's nothing to take away. A lesson that we really all remember. So I've said a lot, but most of you must probably ask me, so what's the list? What do we need to go and do? And I want to, first of all, leave this thought with you from one of my favorite philosophers. Yes, Bruce Lee was a philosopher. You cannot facilitate change within an organization with there's fear. And the reason why there's fear is because people are uncertain. And the only way that we actually get rid of uncertainty is by better understanding. And that better understanding is not logical understanding. There's a very interesting book that maybe you want to go and read. The book's name is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And Kahneman talks about 2 systems of decision making. The one is logical, it's the logical inference engine. It's the thing that we all want to claim that we use when we make decisions. The logical inference engine is like a computer. It's like the frontal lobes of the brain. The problem, though, is that everything goes to the frontal lobes of the brain through the small brain. And that's system 2. That's the emotional decision-making engine. It's the one that talks about instinct. How do I react? Ooh, you want me to change. That's going to threaten my position within the group. You're not valuing what I'm doing. Therefore, you want me to change. So, bearing this in mind, we've defined this list with some great help and input from a gentleman by the name of David Anderson, not the South African itSMF David Anderson. He's also a cool chap. And this is the list that I want to leave you. Start from where you are. Start with what you're doing now. The biggest problem in most organizations is we don't quite know what we are actually doing now. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to define what it is that we do. Don't reorganize. Don't change the process. Just document. Just define it. Just identify where you can measure success criteria within the way that you do things and start measuring that. How do you do that? You do that by going to source. And then we talk about going to Gemba. You go and talk to the people who's actually doing the work. You're not going to go to the ITSM consultant who's going to tell you that this is the best way that the book says that you need to do it. The context is different. Speak to the people who are doing the work. Define work. and make it visible. Make it measurable and make it visible. Then make sure that you create constant flow. So constant flow means optimal output. Then, because you know what it is that you do, together with the guys who's doing it, define the rules. Start measuring. Provide feedback so that everybody can see what the consequences are of doing things the way that we do it now. Let people talk. Create structures where people can collaborate and communicate. Introduce artifacts and rituals. So these are things like stand-up meetings or Kanban boards or value stream maps. Introducing these tools and techniques doesn't change the way that we do things. It just helps us to better understand what it is that we do. And as people understand what it is that they do, they will fix what doesn't work themselves. You don't need to change the organization. If you allow the smart people that you've appointed in your organization, and I'm quite sure all managers will say they only appoint smart people, if we allow those smart people to actually think, innovate, evolve, we will fix all the problems within the organization. So, second last slide. Please, 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 for the sake of chocolates, leave this best practice beers alone. You cannot go and take something out of a book to your organization and expect that it's going to solve a problem. The only way that you're going to solve problems is to enable people within the organization to solve it themselves. And I'm not saying that there's no value in best practice. I'm not saying don't go and do the coded course or the itRight course or the Kepner-Tregoe course or the TOGAF course or whatever. It's tools. It creates context. It gives us ideas in terms of how to respond. But at the end of the day, the world of best practice describes everything. Not everything that's described in best practice applies to your organization. And even if something that is described in best practice applies to your organization, it may not necessarily be something that you can do or be something within your control because you don't have the skills, the resources, the time, the money, or whatever. So understand what it is that you've got control over. Understand what it is that you can do within your environment. Then combine it with what you did before when you started thinking strategically about this hedgehog concept for your organization. What are the things that matters? And for this first part of the journey, in terms of making the organization better, we're going to focus on the complex domain. So that's the overlap here. Complicated domain. Sorry, apologies. The complicated domain. Taking best practice, the stuff that we've learned, together with our view of the organization, going through a bunch of iterations, learn, experiment, implement. Over time, we can focus or we can shift focus away from the complicated environment to the complex environment, the one that you can't leave alone. And I'm really so glad that Stefan actually included this in his presentation because I forgot to do that. The one that we can't leave alone, unfortunately, is the chaotic environment because that's the bit that always bites us. But when you create cohesive, multidisciplinary teams, it's very easy for people to swarm on these unexpected events within the organization, and that's dealing with the chaotic. So that's more or less my message, is start from where you are. Don't try and change the world. Don't start with the implementation of best practices. Create cohesive teams, and you do that by listening to people and showing respect and getting people who's doing the work actually tell you how it's done, defining it, being involved in defining the rules around it, and also the metrics that tells you whether it's successful or not. Then create the environment where people can collaborate and communicate. So that's that introduction of new rituals and artifacts. So rituals, things like a stand-up meeting, artifacts, something like a Kanban board. And then lead people. They will learn themselves, they will fix the stuff themselves. Your job as a manager is to, whenever there's something that inhibits somebody's ability to fix something or to do something better or to achieve an objective, is to take that impediment and actually remove it. Find a way to either work around it or find a way of taking it away so you can leave your people to actually do what you pay them to do, and that's to do intelligent work. So, last slide. Goldilocks principle, not too much, not too little, just right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johann. We do have a few questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
the first question here is, how do you develop a culture of discipline?
Okay. Remember what we said is that you start from where you are, you define what you're doing, yeah? And that you is you, the organization. It is the practitioner. It's the people doing the work, yeah? They define what the work is. They define what the metrics are to measure whether that's successful or not. What you, the manager, do is you take that measurement and you make it visible. You know, so make work visible, make sure that everybody can see it, okay? Not somebody from the outside that came in to tell me how I need to do my work. It's me, a specialist, because that's why the organization employs me, who define what it is that I'm going to do, what's the success criteria, and when we do our stand-up in the morning, it's on the board. It's visible for everybody. It's not nice to actually get the ball if you do your stand-up meeting to say, yesterday I didn't do anything, today I'm going to do nothing, and the impediment is actually me. Okay, so I'm being facetious now. The point, though, is if you allow people to manage themselves, you will find that there's discipline that actually comes into the organization. If you micromanage people, you will not find discipline because then people don't have to think. And not thinking means not having discipline, because somebody else will tell me when I'm not doing my job. So it's a very effective tool to actually to do that in an organization. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. Those are the two things: defining how work is done and making sure that the measures are visible.
Thank you. The next question: where do SMEXA get trained or developed?
Okay, I hear that it started raining on my side, so
the question here is, where do SMEXA get trained or developed?
We do, and that next word I still didn't hear.
So where do we get our SMEXAs trained?
Oh, where do we get our SMEXA trained? Well, there's a bunch of people all over the world that actually offers training around this. Look for organizations that offers training in Lean Six Sigma, in Lean IT, in DevOps, in Agile. But also look for organizations that got the ability to help you to do coaching. So methodology is really important in this journey. Remember, the journey starts with management. And in the beginning, you're going to have lots of questions. So you really need a coach. You really need a SMEXA to help you through this process. At the end of the day, what you want, or your aspiration as a manager is to become a black belt yourself, so that you can become a SMEXA, so that you can be a coach to your team. So was that the question?
That makes sense. Peter, does that answer the question?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you, Johann. And that was really great. Great talk. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, guys. You know where to get me if you want to talk to me.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. If there are no further questions, we can round up the session. Okay, that's all right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. That was great. All the best. Bye.
Awesome, Pete. Enjoy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marina.